Charlie, let me just say first that I absolutely loved your book. But, you know, people might think I'm biased since I'm German. After all, the book is titled An Honorable German. And based on all the World War II movies and books, I imagine most people believe Germans were a pretty evil bunch. So, whatever possessed you to write this from another angle? I mean, that's pretty bold and risky. I mean, you had to believe there was an audience out there for such a book.
Part of it, Herta, was serendipity. I got the idea about writing this book when I was in my 5th year of college at Tulane University, and I was in the library, supposedly studying, and I flipped through Time magazine, and I came across an article about a group of German Navy POWs who had tunneled out of a prison camp near Phoenix, Arizona in 1944. And I kind of thought, and they'd been on a U-boat, and I thought, German Navy POWs in the United States? I mean, how did that happen? And besides, I thought when people were on a U-boat and it got sunk, they all died. I mean, so I started to research this story, and I thought this would be a terrific novel. And that was in 1978. I wrote the first drafts in the late 70s, early 80s, and 30 years later it was published. Because I didn't realize how long it would take to authentically write it from the point of view of somebody in a different country and a different time. And while I had a degree in history, I had to read so much that I would sort of like be different kinds of Germans. I would know what different kinds of Germans would think about stuff.
So are you saying that you actually started your research as long ago as 1978, or you just did little bits and pieces of it?
I started my research in 1978, and in fact in 1980 the book begins with on board the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, and I actually corresponded with the senior navigation officer of the Graf Spee, who was still alive in 1980, and have my letters from him, and he told me a couple of things that made their way into the book, which were sort of interesting. And I corresponded with all kinds of people and tried to track down various stories. There wasn't a lot written in those days about U-boats, and so I read every book in English on the German Navy in World War I and World War II. There weren't that many. And there was really one book about POWs, and so I interviewed people. I went through government records and just anything I could find. I just sort of blundered around. I didn't exactly know how to do it.
Okay, well, that's pretty awesome. But are you saying that back in 1978 or 1980, or when did you actually decide, oh, I'm going to write a novel about this?
I decided I'd write a novel when I read the article in the library. I had actually written 2 novels before that, which fortunately never saw the light of day. Only one person ever read one of them, and it's an older friend of mine, and who was a friend of my mother's, and she was very gentle with me after she read it. Said, "I just don't know. I'm just not sure, which saved my writing career. It was so bad I threw it away. So by the time I started writing things when I was about 10 years old, and by the time I started writing An Honorable German, I had written sort of 2 novels for practice, which I didn't like. I'd written all kinds of stuff, but I didn't have any idea how to write a novel the way it really needed to be done. So I spent almost a year or 2 years reading hundreds of novels, and I'd diagram them out because I didn't understand things like point of view and all that. I had to figure that all out. I didn't go to novel writing school. That didn't exist in those days. So I just figured it out, and it took me a long time.
Okay, that was such a mystery to me. Now that mystery has been unveiled. But, I have this hunch that you actually are a reincarnated U-boat commander. Do you think maybe that you are?
I don't know. I certainly think that people say this about places that they go. So, but I certainly, the time I went to Berlin to check on some things that are in the book, I sort of felt like it would be familiar to me, and I was sort of surprised that I didn't actually know my way around, and that I didn't speak German. It seemed odd. It was a very strange feeling. So, whether that was another life, I don't know. Sometimes I feel that way about other things, and everybody sometimes feels that way, but about different places they go. So I don't know if I was a U-boat commander, but I certainly have always. It's part of it is just the ability to imagine myself in a situation. What would it be like? And actually, my psychiatrist once told me, he said he'd gone to a seminar on creativity and madness, and I said, well, I hope you didn't go on my account. And he said, no, this is before you were seeing me. So I can thank God for that. And he said that in this seminar that shrinks who have worked with writers, particularly writers, discovered that writers especially could access the sort of the boiling unconscious, where all the rage and murderous and love and anger and lust and all of these our primeval emotions are stored, and sort of open that little box up and pull the different emotions out and describe them, and then put the lid back on the box and go have a sandwich. Whereas he said most people they can't do that. They can't let themselves do that. But I can describe what it feels like to be terrified or to kill somebody, but I don't feel like doing that when I'm writing it, although it's very real.
Well, I'm very relieved to hear that, Charlie.
Yeah, good.
I sort of along the lines of this, I just have this thing where I can see you as this young boy playing with your toy soldiers or your toy submarines in the bathtub. Is there any truth to that?
I used to play with toy soldiers, and I got interested in World War II. I think partly my parents had a huge library, and for instance, the first thing I read about World War II was about the Pacific, because that was the shelf that I could reach. And my father died when I was very young. I don't really remember him, but my mother never said anything. She would just say, well, if you can read, if that you can read that, then go ahead and read it. So then I got sort of to the German shelf. I mean, she had this huge library, and I became quite fascinated with the Third Reich, as a lot of people are. And on my first book on U-boats, because I write my name in the year in which I buy a book on the front cover, on the inside cover, is when I was a junior in high school in 1972. I bought my first book on U-boats, and now I have a lot of books on U-boats, but the interest goes back a long way.
I don't really remember which year Das Boot came out. Did that influence you at all in terms of this book and this story?
I'd already written the first drafts of the novel by the time Das Boot came out. So I won't say that it influenced the story so much as that it gave me a very good sense that I was on the right track in the sense of writing it from the German point of view. First was possible, that I felt that I could do that. And secondly, seeing something like that told from the German point of view was sort of like, okay, this is how it's done. So it was less of a inspiration and more of, this is sort of a model of how you would do it. And the truth is, we're all shaped by the experiences we have in life, but the basic emotions people have are the same. Now, how they feel about different things is, of course, completely different depending on the country they're in. But Germans get just as scared as Americans. Americans get just as mean as Germans sometimes. I mean, it was an eye-opener from that point of view.
I'm not sure that you completely answered this. This was part of my first question. Did you feel that you would have an audience for this story?
Well,
because people, really, I've never seen a movie or a book where it is told in a sympathetic way of the Germans. So that's really curious to me that you would, I love that you did that. And I would love to know, and like I said, it was bold and it was risky, and you clearly have had an audience, you have an audience for this. So is there anything more that you can say about that?
I would say that I spoke at the South Carolina Book Festival several years ago. I was an invited speaker along with 150 other invited speakers, and somebody asked me after I had spoken about the book, they said, who do you write for? I mean, who's your audience? And I said, I write for an audience of one, and that's myself. I'm writing a book I want to read, because if I don't like it, and I'm not interested in it, and I don't find it exciting, then how can I expect the readers to find it that way? So I really wasn't thinking about an audience. I just was thinking, I want to write this story. I want to tell this story in a believable way, not so much, not because I have any sympathy for the Third Reich, which obviously I do not, and no rational person does. I mean, I despise the Nazis. But Nazi and German are not synonymous terms, and there were a lot of the book. The main character Max is what does an honorable man do in an impossible situation? I mean, how do you behave? I mean, how do you act? I mean, if you're a person who is an honorable person with a code of ethics, which plenty of Germans felt, how do you deal with being in a situation where the moral universe is completely, inverted? I was just curious about that.
Along those lines, you explored aspects of the war that really aren't given much attention, or at least not that I've seen, like the suffering of the German people at home, and also the war in off the coast of South America. I found that to be pretty interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Well,
World War II was certainly the largest event in human history, and let's hope it remains the largest event. And it certainly has shaped our lives in ways that we can't even yet understand. So I was interested, and I think somebody pointed this out to me long after I'd written the book, but I thought it was pretty interesting. I mean, I'm an 8th generation Southerner, and I grew up in a small town in South Carolina that had been burned by Union troops. And so people talked about that as if it had happened the day before. Mm-hmm. And so there was this sense of growing up. In fact, many Southern historians or historians of the South have written that one of the reasons the South is different, it's the only part of the United States which has ever been, in the minds of the people at the time, occupied by a foreign army. I mean, it's the only part of America that was ever fought over and conquered. And when I would be reading about battles in the Civil War, I mean, a lot of them are taking place places I've been or grew, close by where I grew up. And so the suffering of Southerners was something that people talked about, whereas when you would actually read the history of the Civil War, it would talk about the terrible suffering of slaves. And what the slaves suffered was it's a moral evil that I'm not comparing at all to the suffering of white Southerners. But nonetheless, there was a great deal of suffering amongst white civilians because there were so many people displaced and there was so much disease. And so I was kind of curious about the Germans. I mean, what was it like to be a German? I mean, you're going along, living your life, you're not in favor of Hitler, you didn't vote for the Nazi Party. All of a sudden, this lunatic is leading the country, and you're either a housewife or you own a small store. What does your life become like? And it becomes pretty awful. Mm-hmm. I mean, it becomes awful, and one of the ironies is that a lot of the cities that were destroyed, like Berlin, the Nazis were not popular in Berlin at all. They never got more than about 20% of the vote, 23% of the vote in Berlin, and yet, Berlin was almost completely destroyed. It'd be as if, there was some sort of dictator from some conservative part of the U.S. and New York got blown up. I mean, it would be that kind of thing. South America is interesting because this engagement of the German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee, while it is not widely known people who study the Second World War, it's widely known because it was one of the first. It was the first media event of World War II. As the ships were battling, there was no media there, but as they came up the river and as the Graf Spee was at anchor and they were trying to decide what to do, there was this worldwide radio feed that both sides were listening to. Both sides were listening to the BBC, which was picking up a feed from an American guy who had gone down there to record bird calls in Montevideo, had his radio equipment and started broadcasting. It was just a weird story, but and that engagement not only was a strong violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The Germans, the United States made a very strong protest to the Germans, but when the Uruguayans told the Germans that under the terms of the Hague Convention they had to leave the harbor, not only were they correct in their interpretation, but they were backed by the United States, which the Uruguayans made a point of saying to the Germans. You know, the president, our president spoke to the Honorable President Roosevelt, and he agreed with our position. So this was a pretty strong statement. And curiously, over 500 members of the crew of the Graf Spee ended up settling in Uruguay after the war.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, even though they were interned later up further, but they liked Uruguay.
So, how did you come to pick the Graf Spee?
The Graf Spee, actually, one of the people who was on a submarine. Everything that in the book happened to somebody. It just didn't all happen to the same person. There were people on the Graf Spee who escaped and commanded U-boats, and one of them was even several of them were even captured. So it was sort of making the connection. And to tell you the truth, when I first read about this, I was going to write the German version of The Great Escape. I thought that this will be cool. This will be like they're in Arizona. This will be the German Great Escape. Except by the time they get there, it's done. The novel's finished. So that was sort of a surprise to me. But a number of about 20 officers of the Graf Spee, because they were interned in Buenos Aires because the Uruguayans wanted them to go further up the river, so they went up to Buenos Aires, and so that's where they were interned. And the Argentinian police they just couldn't seem to find a German no matter what, and so people would sort of go to the airport and say, I'm from the Soviet Union, I'm traveling on business or something. I mean, it wasn't very hard for lots of people to get out. They also got out on Japanese ships. So they got back to Germany, a whole group of them, and 3 or 4 commanded U-boats, received a command of a U-boat.
Okay, that was fascinating to me. I love that part in the story. And actually, there was something else that you were making me think of. Oh, I know. So in terms of how you sort of brought that up a minute ago, how you conceived the book initially, I mean, way back when, you actually had this idea that you're going to have the German version of The Great Escape. So your concept for the book, as you're moving into it, how did that shift or change during the writing, and then how does the end product really compare to your original idea?
It doesn't compare to my original idea in the sense of I literally started out doing the research on the prison camps in the U.S., interviewed an author who had written about the escape that I was focused on, corresponded with the guy from the Graf Spee who had led the escape. And so I was very focused on, this is going to be the book. This is what the book is going to be about. Except the escape was not that interesting as I got into it, and I also had to get them into the camp. So that became the story. And so that changed a lot because I didn't think it would be that long. But then I got going with the characters, and the characters kind of hijack the book and sort of, that phrase, none of us do things out of character. Well, once the characters establish themselves in fiction, they don't do things you can't make them do things out of character, or you have to go rewrite the whole thing. So, yeah, it started out as one thing and became completely different.
So, Max Breckendorf, our main character, how did he emerge from this sort of potpourri of information? Where did he come along? Is he based on somebody?
It's not based on really anybody, I would say. I mean, all the in any novel, all the characters are going to have something of the author in them. But actually, at the time I wrote the novel, Max was older than I was, and so he has. What I did was construct what I believed was an interesting personality and somebody that would be a pretty standard kind of thing. I mean, there are some differences, but I mean, he was Prussian. He was from outside of Kiel. I mean, this is where the naval officers were recruited, and still are in the German Navy. They're almost all, sort of families that have been in the Navy. His was unusual in that he wasn't. He was also a Catholic. There weren't that many Catholics in the Navy. I mean, I made him Catholic. His father was a member of the Catholic Center Party, which was obviously opposed to the Nazis, so that gives it a different spin. And I developed him over time as sort of I needed things, and then I would sort of like, well, how's he going to react to this? How's he going to react to that? And as time went on, he became in my head a very complete person, and he would react to things that I would go, well, gee, I was hoping he wouldn't react like that, but it just couldn't be any other way. And he's the honorable German of the title. And he doesn't particularly want to be, he doesn't want to, do the things that he does in terms of, being honorable all the time, but I mean, that's just the way he's raised. I mean, he was raised like a lot of people, and so he knows what the right thing is to do, and he always tries to do that. And of course, it doesn't always help, especially in war.
I found him very compelling as a character, and I think that it added a lot that there was this love affair that he had. It would be one kind of book if it really was just focused on the war. But this made it, in my mind, it gave it a larger canvas. Just from a craft standpoint, I'm not even sure this is a craft question actually, but I was just wondering or curious about what your favorite part of the book was to write.
My favorite part of the book to write, well, there are probably three of them, was the battle scene of the Grafspee and the English ships. The sort of almost the denouement or the anticlimax or whatever about the U-boat. I don't want to give the story away, but sort of one of the key things that happens on the U-boat when there have been depth charged for 8 hours and finally surface. And then I would say what really fascinated me, and it's kind of awful to say, wow, this is fun to write, were the bombing scenes of Berlin. And how can that be fun to write? Well, I don't know, it just is, it just was. It was just sort of fun to write. The stuff in America was fun, but that was much easier to do. So, somebody wrote me and emailed me and said, well, you've made these people in Mississippi look like, complete racist idiots and stuff. And I am a Southerner, and so I'm sort of like, well, I know how people would be in 1943 in Mississippi. I mean, I didn't need to research that. I'd like to some of them like that now. But it was the parts where I had to do a lot of research and then put the character in that situation where there is a lot of emotion, and then write that. And those were by far the most the most fun to write, and they took the most time.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but I really am wondering what your next project is. When are we going to get that next book, Charlie?
Well, I don't actually. I don't know. I don't know the next novel I'm going to write. I've been round and round on this in my head, and although I think about going in various directions, there's something about the Battle of the Atlantic, whether it's from the side of the Royal Navy or from the side of the Germans, that draws me. It was the most critical battle of the war, unquestionably. And whenever you read military history of World War II, depending on the author's point of view, they're always like, well, this was the most important battle of the war. And, they can be writing about 10 people fighting at a crossroads, and they're like, this was the most important battle. But unquestionably, had we not won the Battle of the Atlantic and been able to keep the supply lines from the United States to Great Britain and to the Soviet Union open, Great Britain would have had to surrender, and the Soviet Union may have had to surrender too. People weren't aware of how much material we shipped to the Soviet Union. And that had to go through, just a gauntlet of German U-boats. And we paid a terrible price. I mean, it's over 75,000 Allied sailors, merchant and military, were killed in the Battle of the Atlantic. And so it was it was just, it has all the elements of almost a Shakespearean drama. I mean, it's tragedy. The weather is horrendous. A lot of the men are not particularly, they're young. That's the only people who could stand it. But they're not well trained. It's cold almost all of the time. The escort ships themselves were, they were hell almost to be in. They rocked back and forth so much. People were sick. They leaked. I mean, even officers had 1 or 2 inches of water in their cabins. They weren't healthy. You couldn't get your clothes dry. U-boats were then even worse because everybody was filthy and dirty. They couldn't bathe. They didn't have any way to bathe or shave or brush their teeth. So, I mean, that was disgusting, and the whole thing was just brutal. And in the end, it was just a slugging match, and the Allies studied the combat that was taking place in the North Atlantic far more carefully than the Germans did. And actually, we used consultants, believe it or not, and they worked out the ideal size of a convoy, believe it or not, and all that stuff. And then we were able to install both radar and radio detection finding equipment on the ships, eventually in the North Atlantic, and that turned the tide. So it's such a dramatic story, and there's so many elements to it. I want to write another novel about that. I'm just not sure how I'm going to do it. What I'm writing now is something which is sort of a memoir of an amusing memoir of my time as a fraternity guy at Tulane University in the 19th. And I've written bits and pieces of this over the years and read them to my fraternity brothers, and they're kind of like, you got to write this down, it's just too funny. And so it was New Orleans in the 70s, and I couldn't make these stories up. I couldn't actually invent them. I mean, it was, you couldn't invent. One of my frat brothers got arrested, and I had another fraternity brother whose father was an important political official in New Orleans, and my frat brother had been arrested for a misdemeanor. It was like public drunkenness, which it's hard to get arrested for in New Orleans. And
I was going to say.
So I called my friend called his father, and my friend said, okay, my fraternity brother said, just take him down to the night court, and Mr. Joe will be there. I mean, Mr. Jones will be there, who was the ward healer, literally a ward healer, who carried a Derringer. He's the only person I know who ever carried a Derringer, this guy, Mr. Jones. And they had a big sign over the courtroom that said, no guns allowed in the courtroom, but Mr. Jones brought his Derringer. And my fraternity brother was this, young guy. I was president of the fraternity at that time, and he was like, this is crazy. I mean, I'm going to go to, I don't even have a lawyer. I mean, what are we doing? I said, just don't worry about it. And so they called the case, and literally Mr. Jones goes, and the judge motions him up, and the judge puts his hand on the microphone, and the guy whispers to him, and he leans back and goes, case dismissed. And so I got very involved in politics in New Orleans, and New Orleans was like living in a foreign country when I was there. So the whole thing was...
America was like a foreign country.
Yeah, I mean, and Tulane was a very unusual place, and the fraternity was just... You guys, just like one long, I'm not sure what. So I'm going to write about that. And then, because that's easier and more fun, and then I'll embark on a longer work of fiction.
Well, you kind of stole my last question, which was, do you think you'll ever write about something other than World War II? So I guess that's it.
Yes.
You're doing it.
I'm doing it. And I've written a lot about the South, which I want to pull together. Some on my blog. A lot of it I just wrote. Nobody's ever read any of it. Just wrote for myself or friends or something. I've done a lot of writing. I suppose I'm like a lot of writers, only a portion of the things I've written have actually been published or even been submitted to be published. I mean, I just wrote them for me or people that I knew, or, as I said, my relatives or something who thought, that's hysterical, And that was the only reason I was doing it. And so there's plenty of stuff I've written that I wouldn't submit for publication, not because it's just salacious or anything, not that would be bad, but because it's just too personal, or it's a letter to somebody that sometimes I write long letters to people that I know well that haven't seen about, I don't know, life or whatever. They might be like 7,000 words, so that's almost it's like an essay, but I don't want to publish that.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Herta.